Okay, that's great. Sorry we missed your introduction on the recording, but
Welcome to our panel on civility and political discourse. And we have a number of speakers today. Most of them are present or online. Our first speaker was unable to attend, and this is Professor Alice McLaughlin of the Department of Philosophy at York University. And we will present Alice's PowerPoints at this time.
thanks very much, Philip. So I'll share Alice's PowerPoint. The moral risks of civility. Share.
Yeah, there you go.
Is that showing up?
That's it?
Good.
Yep.
That's great. So we were delighted that Alice McLaughlin was able to join this panel, and because she has a certain expertise in the area of civility and the moral risks of it. But being a dean, and given the various crises that our society is going through right now, there are emergency meetings. And so she has kindly allowed me to present her PowerPoint for her. So she begins by talking about civility, etymology. What is owed to and benefits a citizen versus a barbarian or an outsider? Politeness, good manners, etiquette in the public realm. According to Cheshire Calhoun, it's a communicative virtue that is expressed via conformity to socially established rules of respect, tolerance, and consideration. According to Jeremy Waldron, it's a willingness to respect the formalities of the interaction, subordinating one's feelings toward the other, and disciplining them with rules that are prescribed. It's a constraint on speech. And Alice says these are two definitions of civility. The first is not being, now in my presentation, I'm going to talk about a book called Assholes. So I'll say the full word, assholes. The second is I can do what I want and you can shut up. The latter definition currently dominates American political discourse. According to Adam Serber, civility is overrated in an article in the Atlantic 5 years ago. Now, the case against civility. Civility is a central term through which racial inequality has been maintained, exalted in the language of slaveholders, segregationists, lynch mobs, and eugenicists. Disenfranchised minorities such as women and African Americans have been regularly accused of incivility just by virtue of daring to show up in public and press their rights claims. Bad manners. Social practices that communicate respect will reflect social views about who deserves respect and why. Some of these social views are unequal and discriminatory. Disproportionate burdens. Citizen versus barbarian. Codes of civility reflect the dominant culture, the demand more of outsiders and minorities. Protests, challenges to status quo tend to seem rude. Civil gatekeepers, tone policing, white moderates. Manners are the tool of the mob, Marguerite. Civility at all costs is a kind of political master virtue, Rawls, Calhoun, etc., akin to paradox of toleration arguably intended to operate when there is good reason not to be civil. Civility is toleration. The demands of civility are determined by social consensus, response to difference and disagreement, not to domination or power differentials more generally. It doesn't solve the burdens of gatekeepers. Another strategy, punch up and kiss down. The demands of civility vary with the relative power and each interlocutor. Up and down aren't always so clear. Flattens the agency to social location only. Shuts down solidarity and cooperation. Here's a quote from Alice McLaughlin. For the Greeks, to fight justly against each other meant not destroying the conditions or the possibility of talking with each other, and therefore preserving the most basic conditions of the possibility of politics, and especially some version of democratic politics. I think of politics agonally, which means close to death, and democratically, and so have come to appreciate the Greek commitment to the preservation of the conditions that make talk possible. And that's from Beth Ami Barr on the opposition of politics and war. The conditions that make talk possible. Recognizing the risks, learning to have difficult conversations, and decency as non-humiliation. A set of reflective practices around the norms of civility. Whom are they modeled after? Whom do they exclude, either on paper or in practice? Who wields power in relation to them? And what are the limits of their usefulness? Final thoughts. Those of us who seek justice are simply on our own, in a position of radical responsibility, left with the task of figuring out and enduring models of respect with whatever tools we can gather. Or perhaps we are left to build and rebuild our community guidelines daily, taking our cue from activist communities. But one thing is clear, civility is not to be abandoned because it is flouted and exploited by those who perpetuate oppression. And that's from Olafemi Taiwo, Civility is Self-Determination. So I'll just end the share here. And I'll offer a couple of thoughts about this. Alice McLaughlin, when we were emailing early this morning about whether I should present her PowerPoint for her, and she said yes, she was delighted to be able to be included in some way. And she said she is in favor of civility, but she just wanted to outline that it's risky. It requires a lot of thought. It's not straightforward. And she said, for example, what about the example of the leader of the NDP in the House of Commons having called out another member for making racialized remarks and being expelled from the House of Commons for making that uncivil comment. It's not easy. So thank you very much, Alice, for starting us off with these let's be careful comments. And let's go on to our next speaker, Greg Levine. Greg, I'll try to bring up your PowerPoint for you.
Thanks. Thanks. Can you hear me?
I can certainly hear you.
Great.
Which of these do I bring up? Rudeness, insult, and political discourse.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. Maybe just, yeah, let's start there.
Hey.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel on the declining nature of concerned, genuine, and polite political discourse. Demeaning and insulting behavior seems all too normal in politics, and it is all too common among all levels and all participants, politicians and citizens alike. There's a growing culture of contempt in and through which fellow citizens treat each other poorly. There's growing awareness of the problem, although little obvious transformation of debate, which seems to grow more coarse on a daily basis. Still, there's a growing and rich literature on civility and on the use of insults and rudeness in society and politics. My own experience as an integrity commissioner has given me some insight into the use of rudeness and insults as part of harassment and intimidation. This, quote, use may not be overtly tactical, but it has tactical effects and is demeaning to politics and government. It stifles debate. One example, current example on the citizen side, is what's happening in a council in Ontario, which has essentially had to shut people out in order to function because they've had so many harassing people coming to the meetings, as well as one councillor who continues to disrupt meetings. So what follows is a brief consideration of some aspects of this issue.
Let me know if you want me to change slides, Greg.
Yeah, so if you go to the culture, the next one. Sorry, could you go to the next one? Oh, yeah. No, go back. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. There just doesn't seem to be much discussion of ideas. There's no genuine dialogue. There's a lot of mudslinging, fear-mongering, etc. It permeates our politics and our social relationships. Not hearing others is easier than genuinely searching for or opening oneself to others' views. Contempt is fueled by anger and frustration, but also by arrogance in the face of the other. That is, other people and others' ideas. Let's go to the next one. Yeah. These are dictionary definitions, and I shan't dwell on them, but it's good to have some sense of some level of definition. So insult as disrespectful or abusive remarks, rude as being offensive or ill-mannered. One thing that isn't covered in these definitions is the perception of insult. We may see it where it does not exist, so we take in insult. A good example lately was Trump's reaction, the President Trump's reaction to Bishop Budd's call for mercy. How anyone could possibly be insulted by that is truly disturbing, but he was. And then the plethora of insults came back at her, which really shows the dilemma of our times. Let's go to the next one, please. Here, civility really is about engaging properly with honesty, openness, and decency, and allowing for genuine consideration of views. So that expands that last view on the slide. It's a political virtue that upholds the political idea that amidst our differences and plurality, we can still engage with each other as citizens in a common world. Also for a common purpose, the notion of common good is important, that whatever one's differences are, if they're striving for the public good, dialogue is important. The next slide, please. So who cares anyway? We all yell at each other and go on our merry ways. There are at least two effects. One is that it discourages further participation because who wants to get into a harassing, insulting, and silly environment? And also retaining people. And an example of that actually is the Catherine McKenna case. She was former Minister of Environment, was she was subject to online hate, verbal insults, harm to property, including her campaign office. Sherry Graydon wrote a piece on this, and one of the quotes from that, and it shows the effect, is, and this is a quote from her blog, dealing with the daily onslaught of hate was very hard on her staff, and other women regularly confessed to her they would never consider running for office after witnessing the viciousness of the harassment directed at her. And then on the second point, well, you get, if you have abusive debate, you really don't get much understanding of the issues. And you just have to look at the average question period in our legislatures or in the houses. There's just not much. And then beyond that, a constant personal attacks rather than dealing with issues means we're dealing with pettiness and not policy. Good example of that on the citizen side are all these, you don't see them as much these days, but they're around still. The Trudeau flags, the F asterisk CK Trudeau flags that were on your many trucks, help not a soul. They help no one, except the person flying it, I guess. There's some gratification in just letting loose, but it demeans all of us. Next one, please. Next slide. Anger and frustration happen. We all have outbursts. We all have situations in which we well, lose it. And this can be to actual injustice or perceived injustice. It's an odd thing in our society, and that's why I wanted to mention the idea of performative authenticity, that those who lie, insult, and behave rudely are often perceived as authentic. Of course, one might ask, authentically what? But they are seen somehow being crude elevates the stature as a plain-spoken person. And it can be, authenticity can be feigned, and this can be an act. But even whether it is or not, it doesn't help debate. And it's not intended to. People use insults and bullying to get what they want. It's a power thing. Okay, let's go to the next one. So, when I started looking at this, I turned to Karen Armstrong. I find that book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, very helpful. And one of the chapters is on how to speak to one another. And for her, it's about making a place. That life is social, it's relational. You have to appreciate the other's life and perspective if we're going to actually engage in debate. Genuine dialogue requires trying to understand where the other person is coming from. It also requires that we be charitable in our approach to others, assume they are rational, or that there's at least rationality in what they say, rather than just dismissing. Such dialogue, though, to be frank, may be impossible in situations of distrust. These approaches are laudable, although they assume that one can get to a willing state between two willing partners. Somehow, and what my caution in this, I have a caution about these approaches, is how do you deal with the incorrigible or the intransigent? And I'll come back to that at the end, I guess. I have more hope than I have insight as to what to do. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is a point that was made in Alice's slides. There are numerous arguments that requiring in all situations that there be civility can oppress those who are suffering and not necessarily able to act in a quote polite manner. And it may depend on their situation, and it may depend on the situation. It is a kind of class analysis, but it is about power relationships. So, for instance, when the protesters in Alabama sat in restaurants as an attempt to say they were equal, that would have been seen as rude by the dominant white majority. But it's kind of necessary to do that kind of action. And civility really isn't about niceness. It's not about effete notions of manners, although it could be about genuine courtesy. The class analysis, which argues against elites using civility and politeness to maintain power, has merit, but also can be quite patronizing to those of lower and working class origins who behave well to their fellows and understand the importance of debate. And I should say genuine debate and dialogue. I've been using debate and dialogue interchangeably, but they aren't really. Debate is an adversarial process through which one hopes one arrives at some kind of truth. And dialogue is more searching, more searching process in which you try to get understanding. So, sorry, that was a bit of a digression. Let's go to the next one. And how am I doing time-wise? Here I just wanted, this makes a point also that Alice made, and I won't belabor it. I took those quotes out of John Lewis's writing. There is such a thing as good trouble, making trouble, because you have to push things forward in order for social progress to happen. And that's all I'll say about that. And then finally, where to, which is the next one, I think. Next slide. Yeah, for me, there really isn't an easy route in this. Education, modeling of good behavior, calling out bad behavior when you see it. There's a lot of controversy about the use of codes of conduct. This is something I'm fairly familiar with. I like codes because they set ground rules and they model ideal behaviors, but they aren't a be-all and end-all in themselves. They really are not. There's a lot of debate, too, about how to enforce rules. I won't go off into it, but at the municipal level in Ontario, it's kind of an ombudsman model in which you try to persuade people with some limited sanctions. And now, of course, because of some intransigence, there's a notion that there should be more severe punishments, and that may be helpful. It may not. So I'm sorry about the ambiguous result I've got to. I'm just going to end with the final thought on the last slide. We could pop to that. And really, it's the bottom one. I've become entranced by Micah, so that's why that's up there. But his call for us to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly, it seems to me, are good pieces of advice and, well, requirements, as he says. But it's the last, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I was asked for a final comment at the Collingwood inquiry where I appeared on a policy panel. And really, I could think of nothing better than to cite the golden rule. If the councillors had just respected their own rules and each other, it wouldn't have ended up in the mess that the Collingwood inquiry was called to clear up. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. David, do you want me to bring up your notes, or do you just want to, people have copies of them. If you like, we can post them on our webpage, but I could bring them up now if you like.
Whatever you want to do. That's whatever. I don't know how many people in the audience there have the paper.
No.
Well,
There are just two in the live audience, and they both have
Okay. Okay, well, if it's possible to do it, but I don't want to complicate
I'll
things.
see what I can do.
I'm going to, oh, I'll wait for you.
Oh, here it is.
Yeah.
Here it is, David.
Okay, good. I'm not going to read this from the first page to the eighth. I'm going to cherry pick a bit and actually concentrate on other pages, which I'll talk to, well, which I'll mention in a second. So let me also begin by saying thank you to Philip and you, Ian, for, I think, organizing this and inviting me to participate. It brings back very good memories about the earlier forms of YCPE. And I'm happy to be back at least virtually or via the digital connection with McLaughlin College.
And we should mention that you're in Victoria.
And here I am in Victoria 3 hours earlier than all of you. So I want to begin by just noting that what I've sent you and what you're showing is really the third draft. And I've got a fourth draft, which I'll send with just minor additions, which I'll try to make a point of shortly. Let me begin by saying that there are a couple of things that I think are in the paper, but might have been highlighted. They are more implicit than explicit, I think, in what I was saying. And so let me highlight those. And that is that in the paper and from my perspective, the lack of courtesy, which in so much of political dialogue and political debate now, and which Greg did just a terrific job of noting and summarizing and commenting on. I think the lack of clarity represents, it's the result and the expression of the breakdown in mutual respect, which Ian and I have been talking about for quite some time and written about, but I should have made more of that. That is really, in my view, the lack of civility shows us a terrible gap and breakdown of mutual respect. Secondly, what I should have made more of is the importance of a third party neutral chair or mediator with respect to dispute resolutions or dispute, at least mediations, to maintain civility. I think third party neutral figures are absolutely crucial in also encouraging and providing, in a sense, personal or visible guardrails to the breakdown in civility. So let me move on by saying that I, of course, agree with an enormous amount of what was just said by Greg, and I certainly share almost everything that Ian has to say in his presentation. The slight, I guess, amendments or additions to what I think Ian was saying and getting at, and the slight kind of rethinking that I've been doing as a result of being invited to the panel, rethinking of some things that Ian and I wrote in both of the books that we did together, is that we, I think, should have perhaps made more of the possibilities of the failures of mutual respect and the failures or the difficulties, put it that way, that a number of the new agencies and new methods of checking unethical behavior are faced with, and the difficulties that have been noted, and that what I do on page early on page 2 is note that with all the attempts to bring about more ethics in politics, there has been nevertheless a real loss of trust on the part of Canadians with respect to their political leaders, their political representatives. And I cite 3 major public opinion pollings from 2002 indicating the drop in trust on the part of Canadians for their political leaders. And there are lots of reasons for this. There's never, I don't think, just one reason, but clearly one of the reasons for this has to do with the way that they see politicians acting. And that's acting without civility and without mutual respect for each other. Now, again, for those of you who've got the paper, I'm going to draw your attention to the bottom of page 3. And it may be thought that the problems caused by the competitiveness and adversarial nature of political struggles and politicians wanting to be winners. That's the major problem of the competitiveness. And I want to suggest that it's not the adversarial nature of politics that is responsible for the breakdown in civility. And I go into our Westminster, just a reminder of the Westminster tradition of that in a parliamentary system, the opposition is to be seen and to be also to act as a loyal opposition. So however much they disagree, they are supposed to share their respect for the Constitution, for norms. And then I mentioned briefly the importance of looking at both team sports and also not only team sports, but what happens in the adversarial nature of the law and courts. And in both cases, with one exception in the sports, which I'll get to in a second, just for purposes of having a laugh and a little bit of a tear. But in both instances, what we find is that disputants and competitors, in fact, clearly are required and follow the requirements to not break the rules, to not be rude, offensive, to swear at each other, to taunt each other. And whatever, when it comes to courtrooms, whatever the potentially bad behavior of lawyers may be leading up to a trial, when they walk into court, they're expected to be on their best behavior. And generally, that is the case. And if not, they face contempt. At any rate, our response, one response to the continuing incivility problem, and I'm here on the bottom of page 5, one response to the continuing incivility problem is to give the Speaker and Deputy Speaker more power under the standing orders of Parliament to control debates and hand down much stiffer penalties for those who violate the rules. But it's unlikely that political parties are going to be willing to cede more authority to speakers to apply greater sanctions. It also places a Speaker and Deputy Speaker in potentially vulnerable positions when they return to their parties and when they try to maintain some aspects of their representative functions with their constituencies. So what can be and what ought to be done? And I suggest 2 ways of strengthening civility and the exercise of mutual respect in the debates and question periods of the House. Both involve alterations of long-standing traditions. The first calls for the speaker to be in a new third-party neutral role. The other calls for the adoption and adaptation of an estimable Indigenous tradition and practice. And here I'm on page 6. With regard to my first recommendation, I believe it's time for an appointed third-party speaker and deputy speaker, unbeholden to any political party. The appointees would have the necessary language skills and administrative experience to garner approbation from all political party leaders and the majority of their caucuses. They ought to be chosen for a fixed, perhaps 5-year term, ideally by 5 chiefs of courts of appeal from the 5 principal regions of Canada, with input and nominations from party leaders. The terms of appointment of and conditions of both offices, in my view, should be similar to the appointment conditions for auditors general. Such appointments would have the added benefits of both a governing party and its individual members, for both a governing party and its individual members. In the party's case, it means not having to forego potentially important votes, especially in close minority situations, minority government situations. In the individual's members' cases, it means they are no longer compromised with respect to their partisan activities and representative connections to their constituencies. Their ongoing relationship to their party is no longer conflicted. Currently, a speaker and deputy speaker have little time, limited latitude to represent constituents, and must put their participation in advancing the programs and policies they ran on hold. With regard to my second recommendation, I think it's time for the introduction and use of the First Nations talking stick. A talking stick is called a speaker or speaker staff, and it's also an instrument of Indigenous democracy, which is used by a number of, is used and has been used by a number of Indigenous communities, especially those in the Pacific Northwest nations of North America. The talking stick, familiar to many but not all Indigenous cultures, is an ancient and powerful communication tool. It ensures a conduct of respect during meetings. The person holding the stick, and only that person, is designated as having the right to speak, and all others must listen quietly and respectfully. Talking sticks in the past were most frequently used in council circles and in storytelling circles. Some cultures do not use a talking stick per se, but use an eagle feather, a wampum belt, a peace pipe, or a sacred shell. A great many schools have adopted the talking stick principles in their classrooms as a way to teach children patience. And one of the things can be said about so many of our political representatives in committees of the whole or in budget meetings is they're like children, and they certainly need to be more patient and and have more self-discipline and respect the speaker and the speaker's words. A further bonus when children learn this is that they're learning about Indigenous culture in a tangible way. Now, the following that I'm going to talk about is a scenario depicting a possible configuration whereby use of the talking stick enhances the principles and practices of mutual respect and civility in the everyday practice of MPs and their staffs. Obviously, were a practice like this implemented, it would be, and this I've added to this draft, obviously, were a practice like this implemented, it would be important and useful to first consult with elders from various Indigenous peoples on how to adapt their traditions appropriately. Now, here's one way it might look. Once the talking stick protocol is adopted and adapted into the House's standing orders, the Prime Minister and leaders of loyal opposition parties are to be understood as the equivalent of their party elders. Party elders speak first. All in attendance are expected to listen. Listen with respect, support, compassion, and stillness. So session members are required to listen carefully, not to repeat information that has already been shared. The speaker or deputy speaker will remind members prior to the beginning of every session that interrupting a person holding the talking stick is not allowed. When a leader or whomever is holding the talking stick has finished speaking, the stick is handed to the next person in the circle as set out by the speaker. If the receiver does not wish to speak, it's passed to the next person or handed back to the sergeant at arms, who hands it to another member as recognized by the speaker. The person handed the talking stick and wishing to speak always introduces themselves. When everyone who wishes to speak has spoken in accordance with the time allotted by the speaker, the talking stick is handed back to the leader, who hands it back to the speaker for safekeeping. The talking stick protocol emphasizes the significance of respect and active listening, cultivating an atmosphere of understanding and collaboration. An adapted talking stick protocol that informs and guides the procedures.
When we do that, let me know and I will get out, because that'll be too noisy to watch.
Okay.
But otherwise, I will
We
stay
got
here.
Ron Perlman. We got to mute
Watch
him.
these sessions.
We need to mute him. He wasn't listening attentively to the talking stick. An adapted talking stick protocol that informs and guides the procedures and decorum of the House standing orders would be a remarkable reconstituting of an esteemed traditional democratic practice and a potentially powerful example of reconciliation. Were the first appointee as speaker someone who is familiar with the protocol, so much the better. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'll just get my slides up here. There we go. There we go. Just before starting here, just to continue on from where David left off, for the last 25 years, I have been a beaver leader as part of the 32nd Toronto Scout Group in our area. And we always start the meetings after our opening, we pass the talking stick around. And each beaver gets to introduce himself or herself and talk about what was their favorite thing that happened during the week. Now, the beavers are 5 to 7 years old. The 5-year-olds they're not very good with the talking stick. They're used to interrupting. They're used to being somewhat rude. But after a couple of years, by the time they swim up to cubs, most of them are pretty good at it. And the older beavers will reprimand the younger ones who break the rules. So I think this is just to underline that I think being civil and polite is something that it doesn't just happen. It requires thoughtfulness. It requires training. It's not always straightforward. And the illustration on this slide is from the cover of the first book that David and I wrote together, Honest Politics, in the late 1990s. I love this because we have an angel dancing over the horns of the devil. And when we delve into a subject like this, I think this is what we are basically doing. So I've had a lot of experience with politics and before becoming an academic. I was a campaign manager in the 1968 federal election. The thing that disturbed me most about that experience was the nasty rumors going around, both about my candidate and the other candidates. And I spent, I think, much of my time trying to get people to be civil in all the parties. I even went to the local television station in Red Deer and talked about the importance of civility. They looked at me and said how naive I was, and this could be a lovely story about a campaign manager who was trying to influence the media. And they said, but you know, you're only 20 years old, you're young, you're naive, we won't make this into a story yet. Anyway, it's been a lifelong challenge. Joe Clark became a friend of mine, former prime minister. He's a fellow of McLaughlin College. We had a banquet for him in this room where he said some very distasteful things about Stephen Harper's foreign policy, by the way. Our justice minister in the constituency I live in is Arif Virani. I've met with him a number of times about issues. I think he is extremely civil and straightforward. I admire him a lot. Roy McMurtry, a former chancellor of York University, who's spoken in this room, I admire a great deal. So there are a number of good role models, I think. But I detest politicians like Donald Trump and people like Elon Musk. I think they undermine democracy. Is it okay to be incivil when I'm talking to people like that or about people like that? In thinking about this talk, I thought that much of it is our civil discourses are really an art. Taking into account all the kinds of things we've talked about today, how can we make our discourse as beautiful, as positive as possible? I think the opposite of positive discourse is ugliness, distastefulness, things that I don't want to be part of. And it's very interesting that Sigmund Freud had always been, until he visited the United States, he was always an admirer of the United States. In 1909, he was on a 3-week lecture tour of the United States. And he changed his mind about the US. He said not a majority, but too many Americans are uncivil in that they don't demonstrate respect and dignity. Right. Even those who are respectful often tolerate rudeness and incivility. They put up with it. And he actually predicted that the United States would fail as a country because of the lack of civility and tradition of civility in that country. On March the 8th, the Toronto Star reported that that Kim Campbell, former Prime Minister, said that Pierre Poilievre was a liar and a hate monger. Was that incivil or simply legitimate protest? So both the ethics of intentionalism and consequentialism, I think, lead to the conclusion that politicians are there to serve the public interest. This requires at least a modicum of mutual respect. Economist Joseph Stiglitz, building on Adam Smith, has argued that a high degree of trust in political institutions is necessary for democracy to function. And that trust is built on mutual respect. It's interesting that I was asked to be a consultant and to write a paper for the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform and Party Financing way back in 1991. And the Royal Commission actually organized a 2.5-day conference about whether political parties should develop their own codes of conduct, because there was a feeling that outside codes of conduct are not as effective as those that are more internal. And we invited representatives from all the political parties in 1991 to Ottawa for this conference, and it was equal between men and women. My perception was that the women delegates basically thought it would be wonderful if political parties would clean up their acts, if there would be more mutual respect, more women would get involved. And many of them were reluctant to get involved in politics because of its dirtiness. The male delegates were more in favor of, well, that's politics. That's how it works. You've got to get used to it and put up with it if you want to be part of the system. And the other argument is, if our party becomes the first to develop a code of conduct, the others will destroy us with finding examples of how we haven't lived up to it. So that's why we can't do it. But it's interesting. I got an email message from a researcher in Switzerland recently who said that some political parties now are developing codes of conduct. The Quebec Liberal Party has a fairly decent code of conduct for the party now, and it's enforceable. They've actually thought about it. The Green Party in Canada has a code of conduct. It's not very well thought through. It's not enforceable. But maybe there is room for this sort of improvement in the future. From the perspective of Ronald Dworkin and other political philosophers, every person is entitled to be treated as a social being with intrinsic worth, no matter what are his or her personal attributes, their standing in society, or their lack of the same. Every person deserves equal concern and respect in government institutions. Now, these kinds of principles are ridiculed by Trump and the far right, and there aren't enough people, from my perspective, who are standing up to them. Peter Pence wants to be admitted. Welcome, Peter. Now, in both books that David and I wrote together, we argue that democracy is government based on the principle of mutual respect. And mutual respect means treating others as you'd like to be treated. Greg mentioned Karen Armstrong. I really like her writings. She argues that mutual respect is a fundamental principle in all the major world religions. It's behind Freud's approach to civilization, a balancing of individual and social needs. Now, to David and me, the connection between mutual respect and democracy at the time we wrote our books seems self-evident. Perhaps that this was from our Canadian perspective. We didn't envision the sort of world we live in now where mutual respect is ridiculed by the President of the United States. Then, as both Greg and Alice have mentioned, there is such a thing as righteous indignation. Sometimes we have to deviate from mutual respect for reasons that we have thought through and we think are effective. And I came across a book a few years ago called Assholes, a Theory. This was written by a philosopher, Aaron James. His theory is that a person counts as an asshole when and only when he systematically allows himself to enjoy special advantages in interpersonal relations out of an entrenched sense of entitlement that immunizes him against the complaints of other people. He asks, can we ultimately make peace not only with the given asshole, but also with a social condition in which assholes flourish? He argues that every society will produce some assholes. Those of us who believe in mutual respect can withstand the abuse of assholes because we have faith in a better world. So David and I have argued that in spite of setbacks, in general, over the decades, Canadian politics has become more ethical and is continuing to become. James argues for sympathetic dialogue with the people that he refers to as assholes. He ends his book with a letter to assholes, trying to persuade them to look at life differently. And in fact, I think there's a lot of truth in this. Many of us, when we encounter people who are uncivil, don't believe in mutual respect. We simply walk away. We don't want to engage, but I think we have to engage. It's something we can't simply ignore. That takes a lot of practice. It takes strategy. So the way forward, I think, don't leave rude and insulting behavior unchallenged. Develop strategies based on the question, how can what I'm thinking of do some good? How can it have a possible positive outcome? Another person who spoke in this room in 2008 was Barbara Coloroso. She's written a number of books about how to bring up your children. One of the books she wrote was The Bully, the Bullied, and the Bystander. She was speaking here at York University on a conference about Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda. And she's written a book about Rwanda in which she argued that the tolerance of bullyism really led to the genocide in Rwanda. So she gave a talk in this room about how to deal with bullies, not only in school, but in universities and other walks of life. And then she did some role plays. She asked some of the people who attended this session to imitate being a bully or imitate the worst bully they'd ever seen. And then she would offer a response. And the response was always to say, no, you can't do this. In a polite way, polite but firm way, you can't do this. This is not acceptable behavior. And then explain why it's not acceptable. But then give that person the opportunity for some redemption so that they're not simply put down and made to feel inhuman. But there is a chance that everybody makes mistakes. There is a better way of behavior. So I think the bottom line, it's not acceptable to be rude and insulting in politics in most cases, but it's up to all of us to attempt to challenge inappropriate behavior and try to make a difference. Now I think we can have some discussion. I'll just end my PowerPoint here. So we have a number of participants, we have four in this room, but a number online. And you're the chair, Philip, so I'll let you moderate this discussion. I'll just turn the camera on you.
Well, I'll start with a question. You say on righteous indignation, you and David have argued that in spite of setbacks, in general, Canadian politics has become more ethical over the decades. And then on page 2 of David's presentation, he says the findings that he quotes of weakened trust come in just 5 years after publication of our Honest Politics Now. So is it the case that Canadian politics is more ethical now, or has there rather been a degeneration and that Canadian politics is less ethical now than when you wrote Honest Politics Now?
Thank you, David. Do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. Well, if you want. Can I just say also, I'm looking at some of the people who've joined us digitally, and since I'm in Victoria, long a ways from McLaughlin College, and I haven't gotten there, but it's so terrific to be reminded of wonderful Gwyn Buck and David Leighton Brown and Peter Penns, who I wish I'd see more of over the past years. So it's certainly a great thing to see them on this connection. So let me get to that point raised by Philip. And I suspect there's a wee difference, but it's really a wee one. And I wish I were young enough right now to have a wee scotch while I was talking. But I expected when Ian and I finished the update of Honest Politics, called Honest Politics Now, 5.5 years ago, I did think that we were heading in the right direction and that the quality of ethics in politics was going to be certainly improved as a result of the various new agencies and various guardrails being put in and incentives put in. I'm now less confident about that. However, having said that, with perhaps some qualification with respect to what we said then and what Ian may now still feel, I think that when there is a loss of confidence in politicians, when pollsters find that that the trust level has deteriorated, I think in some respects that's because people are in fact indicating their upset with some gaps, with some failings on the part of their leaders. And I happen to think, without being able to give you an immediate documentation of this or for sources, that a number of the things done by our current but soon to be former prime minister upset people, not in terms of public policy so much as his gaffes and a number of things that with respect to how he dealt with the C. Lavalin issue and the Attorney General Justice Minister at the time, the fact that he took, he didn't need to, but that he took vacations at the expense of wealthy figures and seemed to think that there was nothing wrong with that, and then had to be called to on it by the ethics commissioner. I think people, in fact, are indicating that they are more sensitive to ethical gaffes without, of course, any scandals about bribery, anything like that. So there's this is unfortunate. I'm sounding like the typical academic. There's on the one hand this and on the other hand that. But I wish in a way that Ian, we had spent more time on the possible downsides. We were, both of us, I think, so optimistic about things that we could have talked about more of the downsides or more of the worries and failings that were possible. But that's all I want to say about that. So it's over to you, Ian.
Okay, thanks, David. And the first thing I'd like to do is to ask people who are on the joining us by Zoom, if you'd like to say something, just maybe use Zoom to raise your hand or open your camera and just raise your physical hand. And that would be an easier way of moderating this. Anyway, Greg, so after my comments, I'll head over to you, Greg. Thank you. And David Leighton Brown has raised his hand too. So I just wanted to say that in the late 80s, when I started, I wrote a book, I wrote an essay for the Canadian Journal of Political Science about conflicts of interest in politics. And this was when I was up for tenure. I needed to get another article published. I needed my background in public law and my background in public administration to write something. And there were so many conflict of interest scandals going on federally, provincially, municipally in Canada in the late 1980s that I thought this would be a good topic. So the article got published, and and then one of the areas I started working in was ethics and politics. Anyway, when I was writing that article, I was just, all of the major newspapers in Canada were just covered with stories about conflicts of interest, federally, provincially, municipally. I often felt physically sick to do my research because all of these papers were simply covered with scandals. And of course, the level of trust the Canadians had in their politicians at the time was, 25, 30% at the very most because of all these scandals. And the reason I became more optimistic is that after the introduction of independent ethics commissioners in all the provinces and then in the House of Commons and the Senate, the number of ethics scandals involving conflicts of interest dropped precipitously. And I think at the most recent count, there have been on an average one allegation of conflict of interest provincially every 2 years. And the great majority of those are not substantiated. It's worse with regard to the House of, Senate is actually doing pretty well. The House of Commons is not. And I think the reason is that members of the House of Commons are not required to meet with somebody in the Ethics Commissioner's office when they're elected and then once a year afterwards. This is required now in most of the provinces, many municipalities. And it does a lot of good because elected members think they're ethical, but they don't necessarily understand the rules. And the ethics problems that Justin Trudeau could have got into could have been avoided had he gone to the commissioner's office and said, is this okay? Is this behavior okay? And it would have been prevented. I've spoken at least a couple of times to the ethics committee of the House of Commons, and I've said, make the annual meetings with the commissioner's office mandatory, not simply that you choose to do it. And they nod their heads and they go on with other things and they get into trouble. So I think that's one of the problems we have. But the other thing, there have been very few conflict of interest scandals in Canada since the late 1980s for reasons I've mentioned. But other issues have come along, some that were mentioned by David, but also COVID did a great deal, I think, to undermine civility in this country and the United States and other countries. And we're still working our way through solutions to problems that occurred then. So now Greg first and then David Leighton Brown.
Okay, just a kind of footnote. Philip asked, so if ethics are improving, why are the statistics there on distrust, right? And it could be, I wouldn't equate them in a sense. There could be more ethical behavior, but people could still be distrustful, right? They don't necessarily, because there's more ethical behavior, and it's always been the assumption that if you could get more ethical behavior, people would trust government more. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the case.
Actually, in the 1990s, once we got ethics commissioners and fewer ethics scandals, the level of trust by Canadians in their politicians went up to the late 60%, almost 70% at some points.
Right.
So there does seem to be a correlation, but I agree it's not an absolute.
Yeah, it reminded me of a question David asked me many, many years ago. I don't know if you remember this, David, but you asked, it was at some talk I gave at McLaughlin. You asked, are we creating institutions which, in fact, foster distrust? And I've never really had an answer for that, but theoretically, we could be doing that. Because people now know they can complain, and they can actually, and they start to see conflicts of interest even where they aren't there. I've had a lot of experience with that, of spending hours and hours of talking to people who were sure that the mayor was in the municipality I was dealing with was totally corrupt. And you could talk to them for hours about what they meant by corruption and what they meant by conflict of interest. And they were wrong, right? They're just objectively wrong, but they were sure that there was something there. So all I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily follow that if you have the institutions. I accept what you're saying, Ian, that in fact, you can show that it has improved, but it's not necessarily the case.
David Leighton Brown. David, you're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me give a little preamble and then ask the members of the panel to react. You have given essentially the cause of reduced civility being a decline in mutual respect. And I want to suggest that perhaps there is a more tactical kind of example, which is the proven effectiveness of negative critical campaigning rather than positive campaigning, not just in Canada, but throughout the democratic world. And it becomes learned behavior. And it models then a kind of mutually exclusive attitude to opponents that leads to all of the incivility that all of you lament, and I lament as well. So one question is, how much is the I'll call it consensus among both political scientists and political operatives about the effectiveness of negative campaigning, a contributing factor to the decline of mutual respect and the consequence of incivility. But also, I want to ask what you think about normalization of behavior. When we see role models behaving incivilly, when we see the Donald Trumps of the world unrestrained by standards of civil action, why should we be surprised that non-political leaders demonstrate the same kinds of behavior? And to complete the circle of questions, the way forward that Ian described, and that all of you in various ways have agreed to, is don't leave incivility unchallenged, offer alternative, more desirable ways of behavior, and so on. How can the public respond to the demonstrated incivility of those that they cannot interact with directly? How is it possible to alter that normalized behavior unless you are one of the players? So with all of that, over to you to respond to whatever you would care.
Thank you so much, David. Very, very penetrating questions. And I'm wondering if Fred Fletcher would like to think about that and give a response. If so, you can come up here and use the microphone. But just before that, David or Greg, do you have any comments?
Well, I do. I have some comments, but I'd like to hear Fred. I mean, I'd like to maybe, although David asked the panel, and I think he raises good questions for sure that need to be responded to. But it'd be good to have somebody from the audience there, or Fred, come up.
Would you like to come up and comment, Fred? Great, he's going to come. No, you can take this seat. And you'll be beside the microphone. All right. See here.
This has been a very stimulating hour. I have a lot of notes. And I think one way to deal with David's question and the larger issues is to think about the incentives and disincentives to uncivil political discourse. And it's the data, the research on negative advertising is it works in the short run under certain circumstances, and in other circumstances, it doesn't. There's a popular view among political strategists that it works a lot, but it doesn't. Sometimes it backfires. So it's complicated. I've been thinking about the incentives to uncivil political discourse. One is that we now live in a world where the competition for attention is fierce. Many voters don't pay much attention. Getting their attention is a challenge. The changing media environment and the other forms of change that have made it more difficult. One of the incentives is the adversarial system in Parliament, but in particular, the televising of question period. And I've begun to wonder if question period is worth having, or maybe it should be curtailed, as in Britain. Another incentive is that in the case of social media, for example, the monetization of attention. And this is exacerbated by anonymity on social media, which makes it possible to attack others without being responded to in any way. And that leads me to another political observation that in the past, the disincentive to attacks and to incivility, insult, rudeness, in part was that it threatened to destroy the system. That, I mean, the best example I can think of is the George W. Bush Al Gore election, in which it turns out Al Gore actually won. But when the votes were recounted in Florida by AP and a group of political scientists, Associated Press, but he decided to concede after the Supreme Court decision in order to preserve the system. And that was generally true of politicians. They would not go beyond a certain line, even in the when it was beneficial to them to be uncivil, because they cared about the future of the system, which they hoped to benefit themselves by participating in. And you can see what's happening with the right in Europe and the Trump-Musk phenomenon, that they don't care about the system. They're prepared. They're willing to destroy it. They don't have any long-term goal. They only have short-term goals. And when that sense of the common good and the value of the system is gone and the trust declines, there's no disincentive for this kind of behavior. And they can trace it back to the distrust of institutions and of politicians in a significant segment of voters. And without being completely Marxist, I would say that economic inequality is the fundamental root of the increase in distrust. Oh, that's what some of the things what we heard inspired me to say.
Thank you so much, Fred.
Don't talk
Careful these wires, Fred, here.
Yeah.
Lift up your foot. Lift up, okay, go ahead.
We're so lucky to have Fred Fletcher with us here today, one of the world's leading experts on media and politics. Any other comments or questions from those who are with us today? David, I was thinking about your observation and your question. Question: what can be done? I've been thinking about writing a letter to my American friends, all of whom are ethical and practice mutual respect, and just encourage them to take some action with regard to the disrespect that is happening in the United States, and especially in the Republican Party. That there do need to be people who stand up to the kinds of things that have been happening, or perhaps Freud is right, and the United States will eventually disintegrate under this load. So I think we need to think about what each of us can do to make a positive contribution. Similarly, in Canada, I've been thinking about writing a letter to the executives of all the political parties in Canada with some ideas about the parties themselves tackling the idea of mutual respect in their conferences. Is there anyone else who would like to comment?
I'll comment in a minute, Ian, but I think there was something from one of the people online, David Cousins.
Yes. David, would you like to comment?
Well, I just posted something. Just again, thank you guys all. It's a little bit distressing to me that the situation in Canada seems to be as bad as it is in the US. And we have the world's leader in rudeness. And I appreciate your comments about how we can maybe proactively change some of the attitudes that seem to exist, because it's really very troubling.
Thank you, David. Bruce, did you want to say something?
Yeah,
you better come up here.
Yeah, I was just very encouraged by David Sugarman's comments about the talking stick. I spent quite a lot of time in the Yukon with the First Nations, and I was given by the chief at the time an eagle feather, and he gifted it to me, and I was very honored, and because that is exactly what the eagle feather is for. And I think it's a very insightful comment that David made about Parliament and the talking stick and using it as a tool for decorum within Parliament. That was my one comment. The other comment was I've do a lot of volunteering with various age groups. And I've done it for many, many years. And what I'm finding is that the problems of decorum and civility don't start as adults. And I was very encouraged by Ian's comments about beavers and using a talking stick at beavers, because that's where it's got to start. There was a little book published a number of years ago, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And I think that's very true. I'm very discouraged by the fact that there's not a lot of civics being taught at schools. So children are not coming out of school with an understanding of the political process. They're not coming out of school with an understanding of the judicial process, which is where my area of specialization is. And as a result, they don't know what politics is supposed to be. So when you have somebody like Donald Trump come along and they see this and they think it's funny and they think it's entertaining, it's very appealing to them because they don't understand what it's supposed to be. And so those are just my comments that I think, the changes to institutions will only start working when we have a generation that understands what's expected. And I don't think we have that anymore. So I think that's all I wanted to say. But this has been an extremely great session. I've really enjoyed everything that people have said. And David, I especially, I don't want to center you out, but your comments about the talking stick, they resonated with me so much because of my experience with First Nations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. So, and also we need to thank Bruce because Earlier on in this session, I got a message that I was short of power, and Bruce discovered that the plug-in to my computer had come loose, and he plugged it in again. So we were able to continue. So thank you very much. So I'd like to turn it over to Phil McEwen now to wrap things up.
Well, thank you for everybody's participation and comments. Let me make a few concluding observations here. I think it's very dangerous to point fingers at especially culpable parties. We should be citing examples of civility and good manners in politics, and there are many examples of this, rather than citing bad examples. And if we're going to get into that, we become very partisan right off the top. It's not going to work. So we have to think along the lines of David's speaker and deputy speaker, who are nonpartisan, people who have established admirable careers in the private sector, the public sector, but not necessarily in partisan politics. And these are the people that we should be looking to provide us with role models for how to be civil, not only in politics, but in general life. But those are some of my concluding observations. Thank you to all the speakers and for all the participants and for the audience, because we've had a very interactive session, and perhaps we'll have to have another session because there are just so many things to talk about when it comes to political civility. Not so much political incivility, but political civility. Start to think in terms of the virtue rather than the vice. I've been reading a lot of Alistair McIntyre recently. I'm going to England to present a paper on McIntyre at the Political Studies Association in April, and his emphasis on virtue is extremely important when it comes to how to get along better, even in this social media culture in which we live, which has so few parameters on incivility and encourages it to a large extent because there aren't the traditional supports for civility and virtue. We can go online and spew venom and gain praise often for so doing. So I think that we should perhaps have another session on civility, not only in political discourse, but in our common discourse. But I would want to conclude on a positive note that we enjoyed the participation of the panelists and for everybody who helped to organize the session. And it's been good to renew some old contacts and see some familiar faces we haven't seen here for a long time. And we look forward to doing this again sometime soon. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you, Philip.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oh, and this will be posted on the YCPE webpage. We recorded it, but it's a bit of a complex procedure, so it probably won't be posted till tomorrow. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.